Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
I'm trying to do background like you guys, but I have this little poster here.
Are you in the store or are you?
I'm in the store right now, actually. It's a pretty busy Thursday night from all things considered, but yeah. I mean, I guess people are stocking up for their snow day reads. But yeah, all right. So I think if we're all ready to go, let's give it, we can definitely start. All right, so good evening, everyone, and Happy New Year. My name is Isa, and I am a bookseller at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I will be your host for this evening. I'd like to welcome all of you to PNP Live, and thank you for joining us in this virtual format amid these extraordinary times, throughout all of which we strive to continue to bring you the authors you love and their new books to our Politics and Prose community. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase The Latinist by Prins on the Politics and Prose website. Additionally, you can ask the author a question by clicking on Q&A, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. And while we'll try to get to everyone's questions after this presentation, we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. Finally, we want to thank you all for being here with us tonight. We are so thankful for our community of loyal customers and friends for keeping our business and our spirits afloat. So it is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. We have Prins, who is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. He has received fellowships from the Truman Capote Trust, the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, and the Sun Valley Writers Conference. Previously, he studied literature at Williams College and Exeter College in Oxford. Currently, he lives in Brooklyn, New York. And joining us this evening to moderate the talk will be Alexandra Andrews, who has worked as a journalist, editor, and copywriter in New York and Paris. Her first book, Who is Maud Dixon, was named a Best Book of the Year by Time, NPR, and Publishers Weekly. She also lives in Brooklyn with her husband and children, and she's currently working on her second novel. So we'll be super excited for that. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Mark and Alexandra to PNP Live.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. I think Mark is probably going to kick it off with a reading, but before he does, I'll just mention that the way I came to this book was it was sent to me out of the blue, probably a few months ago now, and I picked it up with really low expectations. I get sent a lot of books that are just not very good, and I started reading it, and I was shocked to discover that this is the exact type of book I'm always looking for, and it's incredibly hard to find, which is a work of real psychological suspense, but written by somebody who's clearly very steeped in the traditions of literary fiction and who understands very well character development and pacing and all that good stuff. So it was a total delight. And if you have not purchased it yet, I do recommend that you do. And I'm just thrilled to be here talking about it. And Mark, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here too. With you, Ali, and it's so funny because your experience almost exactly mirrors my experience of Who is Maud Dixon. So that's amazing. I'm happy to be here with you and so happy to be hosted by Politics and Prose as well. So I'll just give like a sort of short synopsis of what the book's about, and then I'll do a short reading and then we'll start to talk. So the book examines a turbulent mentor-mentee relationship between two academics at Oxford University, which loosely mirrors the Apollo and Daphne myth, in which Daphne narrowly escapes the advances of the god Apollo, but only by being turned into a laurel tree. So in the book, we follow an ambitious young American scholar who's sabotaged by her mentor. And in the cat and mouse game that ensues, she finds herself doing whatever it takes to come out on top, as she struggles to reclaim agency over her personal, professional, and intellectual existence. So all this is to say it's a book about love and revenge and power and powerlessness, and ultimately about how far we'll go for the things that we desire. So I'll read like a short passage here, which is about 100 pages into the book. And just to give you some context, Tessa Templeton has just decided that she's going to skip her boyfriend's father's funeral. Her boyfriend's father has just died because she has a very, very important conference in Edinburgh at which she's delivering a speech that is pivotal for her career. And this is one of the only flashbacks in the book. It takes place a couple of years before the main action. And she's in the car with her mentor, Chris, who she hasn't quite realized she's going to have a very problematic relationship with. So I'll just start. Edinburgh. In the months leading up to the conference, Tessa sometimes allowed herself to marvel at her change in circumstance from truck stop Waffle House to plenary session speaker in 6 short years. Tessa is from North Florida. Chris drove them in his Fiat, speeding the length of the Isle of England to compensate for the flights they'd missed, casting cigarette butts into the annihilating rush of the open window. We already missed flights so I could be with Ben when Gabriel passed, Tessa justified. This is not something that I can afford to skip. He understands. I think he understands. Chris nodded and smoked, and occasionally Tessa smoked too. He had brought a package of tobacco and papers, Tessa's preference. Chris listened with solemn intensity, and gradually the conversation became more personal. Maybe she was nervous about the 322-person seating capacity. Maybe she needed weighty conversation to distract herself from the guilt that gnawed at her sleepless brain. Maybe she found in Chris an essential audience for the decision she had made. But in that journey, she felt herself hovering on the brink of what she did not know exactly. She knew only the trajectory of her life thus far and the imperative of persuading the car's inhabitants of that narrative. She told Chris about the first time she'd heard Ben play music, how the guitar ruffled the air and then his voice flooded the concert hall with a low vibrato, how she'd felt a chill along her arms and in her heart. The music moved her. Who was he and how had he just happened like that? Because that was how it seemed to her that he had happened, or that the music had happened, in the same way that her most sublime encounters with poetry felt like happenings, lodged in the time and space of her past as deeply and irrevocably as major life events, Apollo and Daphne, her high school graduation, those passages from Blake's Jerusalem, her father's funeral. Soon they were skirting Birmingham, then Manchester, and her thoughts began to spill out muddled but constant as she rolled new cigarettes, white cadaver-like tubes. The important thing was not Ben right now, but her relationship to these moments. She told Chris how she still possessed the yellowing notebook page on which she'd written her high school translation of those 100 lines beginning Primus amor Daphne Phoebe. Phoebe is the sun god and it means Apollo. How that first encounter with Daphne and Apollo had struck her at her core, made a claim on her, raised her hairs on end, and dragged her soul just for a moment out of her body. As brittle trees on the median strip flitted by, she told Chris how she translated in frondem crines, in ramos brachia crescunt, as into foliage her hair, into branches her arms developed, and how develop at the time was still being bandied about as a sanitized descriptor for the mutations she and her classmates were undergoing. Her arms had still felt like ever-lengthening noodles. There was apparently certain hair she was allowed to have and certain she was not. She was still growing used to her own odors. Her body had transformed, was transforming, and since it was her first trip through adolescence, she had no reason to think she wouldn't transform into another species next. The euphemisms of sex ed had formed a kind of rip current against the profanity that spilled from music, TV, the lips of her classmates, and she recalled noticing the last 4 letters of the Latin verb even as she translated it to its most staid English equivalent, crescunt, develop. She recalled something rebellious and alluring about this observation, how language could be layered and insurgent. And maybe it was this that had caused the world to stop and be perfectly articulated in the text. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you for that. That was lovely. And it's actually a good entree to my first question, which, and I hope you won't be offended by this, but if somebody had handed me this book without the author's name on it, I would have assumed it was written by a woman. It's
No,
very
that's an enormous compliment, actually.
okay, good. I mean, yeah, and especially when I knew it was written by a man, I think you're a little primed to be like, to look for faults and for it to be like, no, that's not what it's like. But I think you did it very well. Especially, Tessa, she's in a vulnerable position, but she herself is not a vulnerable person. She's a strong person. And I think that's a very fine line to walk. So how did you choose to write a book that is so female-centered? Were you aware of the risks when you started? Tell me a little bit about this.
Yeah. Well, when I started, it was almost sort of by accident. I mean, I'll go back just a little bit to when, I was in my first year in my MFA, and I was writing this, trying to write a novel about 3 young adults. One was a classicist who had been to Oxford, and another was a ballet dancer who only had 1 leg. And everyone was bored by this project, myself most of all. And, it was in my second year of my grad school program when my back was against the wall and I had to show something to my class. And, I stumbled upon these paragraphs that I had written the year before from the perspective of this classicist, Tessa, from the perspective of her dissertation advisor at Oxford. And they were the only thing I had done the entire year before that had any purpose or reason to exist. And so I sort of wrote the first chapter very quickly and showed it to my workshop class, is what it's called. And it hit a nerve, and people really responded to it. And so it was almost by accident that the story started to roll forward. And then that's sort of setting the context. But then there was a huge learning curve that needed to be cleared, especially with writing Tessa, because as any of my peers in that class can attest, it was not natural. It did not come at first try. So, I mean, I can talk about that as well, but that's sort of how it happened. It was sort of an accident. I never really set out to write the novel that I ended up writing. And that's often how the writing process works for me. I never end up writing what I intend to, unfortunately.
That's interesting. It was your subconscious demanding that this is what you write.
Yeah.
Did anyone, or did you ever think at some point, I can't do this, or this is crazy? Or did anyone ever say to you, you can't write a book from a woman's point of view?
No one really said that to me explicitly. I feel sometimes people will give you feedback that will make you understand that what they're really thinking is this is not a good idea. And I got enough encouragement from some people who really believed in the energy that was there in those initial pages that I continued on. And I guess I'm a little bit like Tessa in some regards, the protagonist, where I'm stubborn, and if someone tells me not to do something, then I probably will do it. But yeah, I mean, there was it didn't come naturally at first, and my peers, they started to point out to me when they saw some of those early drafts, just as an example, that it didn't really feel like, I was writing these tense confrontation scenes between Tessa and Chris. And, Chris, for most of you who haven't read the book, is, he's a little bit volatile, and he's, from the get-go, you realize he's not a good guy. And he has at a minimum, some bad predatory instincts towards Tessa. And so I was writing these tense confrontation scenes, and my peers were sort of saying, she doesn't really seem scared, or she doesn't seem intimidated. And I sort of realized that as I was writing her, I hadn't really left my own body. And, I'm a man, I'm over 6 feet tall. And when I actually imagined myself looking up slightly at Chris, as opposed to looking down, it was one of those small things that began to almost imperceptibly enable me to begin to inhabit the space that Tessa inhabits. And then, and I can talk about other little things because there were like hundreds of them, but little small things that enabled it to start to be more successful. And the reader, I guess, can ultimately judge whether it was successful, but I promise you that it was better, that this is better than how it started out. Yeah.
That's so interesting you say that about looking up at Chris, because I had this thought when I was reading the book, and I don't even have a question around it, but it was just this idea of like Tessa and Chris are so steeped in the life of the mind. It's right. Just, it's so academic, and it seems there almost seems like their bodies like don't even play a part. And then Tessa chooses her boyfriend who is very physical. He's a musician, he's a diver, and then even these this poet that she's investigating. I mean, even there's like some of the, I won't get into too much, but like some of the physicality comes in, and there's a dig, like there's an excavation, and it's about their physical bodies. And there was a cool thing. I can talk about the ear thing, right?
Yeah.
This is really cool thing where they were excavating the site, and they discovered basically like surfer's ear inside some of the divers. Skulls, which made that up, right?
Like partially, like, I mean, the research is like a whole other thing, but that was one of those things that's partially in fact that I just had to use.
It's a great bit. So they had little, I don't think I was actually clear enough about that. They had little bone spurs inside their ear, and it inhibited their hearing. And this sort of deafness makes its way into this ancient poet's work that Tessa is investigating. As you might start to understand, there are a lot of layers to this. It makes it great to read, but I'm going to try to be as clear as possible when I'm discussing it. But what I actually admired about this book is that there's this tension, and there's this level of constant threat, like emanating from Chris, but it's not physical. And I think you did that in a really interesting way, because I think in a lot of, I mean, we'll get to this later about like whether or not it's a thriller, because I know we both are very interested in this idea. But in a lot of thrillers, it comes down to, I mean, fights or, like things that get more physical. And I think you did a really beautiful job of having the tension just be on an intellectual level, and it makes the dialogue sparkle. It makes like everything very, I don't know what the right word is, but was that conscious to sort of have it not devolve into like a physical confrontation or?
Yeah, I mean, they're academics in Oxford. So, and I love that sort of like intellectual tension and sort of the implication of danger. And I really wanted it to simmer. And I think that the book definitely simmers, and, it ultimately gets to a point that's more physical, but it takes a while to get there. And I think that that's really important because, for me, for writing novels and reading novels, like whatever it is you're talking about has to be real. Like you have to be able to touch it. It has to have texture before it can have any more sort of like symbolic or metaphorical or character-driven meaning. And so, I felt like I really wanted to establish, the reality of all of these physical locations, which are, the things that they're wearing, or the landscape of Oxford and the landscape of Italy, where the book primarily takes place.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to back up a little bit. So you did choose to, so most of the book is from Tessa's point of view, but you did choose to layer in some of Chris's point of view as well. Can you talk about that choice?
Yeah. It's so funny talking about these as choices because so often they're not.
I know. Why did Chris butt in?
I mean, Chris, I found that Chris was actually not very difficult to write at first. Chris is a middle-aged classicist, and he's the head of classics at Westphalian College. at Oxford University. And so he has a lot of stature in the field. But he also kind of has a chip on his shoulder, and he's not from a privileged background. He's had to work for everything that he's achieved. His parents are more sort of working class. He's from generations of shepherds, the Eccles shepherds, he refers to them as. And he also just like is constantly offending sensibilities. And that was sort of the fun thing about Chris, is that, I was sort of just always thinking of, it's like the worst thing that one could imagine doing in a situation. And a lot of people have those thoughts, but most of us are able to say like, no, I shouldn't do that, because we've developed social consciences. But Chris doesn't really have that. And, I once had a teacher who say plot is bad behavior, and Chris is like the incarnation of bad behavior and plot. And so he was fun to write. And I think just by virtue of that, he was just in the book. Like, he was driving so much of the energy in the book. He's, he brings a lot to the table. But I encountered a difficulty with him, which is that he is kind of shallow. Like, it's hard for him to empathize with people. He's not like a full, rich character in the same way that Tessa is, who's rounder. And so there was things that began to happen with Chris, and, his mother becomes sick and he becomes sort of a reluctant caretaker of her. And there are certain things that, I tried to add in to make him a little bit more human. But yeah, it wasn't really a choice so much as like an instinct for him to be in the novel. And, also in order to do this sort of reimagining of the Apollo and Daphne myth, I wanted to have this friction between the two perspectives. And I thought that also brought a lot to the book as well.
Yeah. So let's talk about Chris's love for Tessa.
Right.
There's this bit in the footnote fight between Chris and Tessa, which is, well, you explain it.
Okay, yeah. In the beginning of the book, there's, talking about this like simmering tension. There's just this ongoing fight between Chris and Tessa about this Apollo and Daphne sequence from Ovid, which I sort of alluded to in the reading. There's this fight about love in the passage, because Apollo is described as being in love with Daphne. And Tessa talks about the love as being in an ironic sense from the way that Ovid wrote it. And she has a paper that's being held up because the blind reviewers are saying, Apollo really is in love with Daphne. How can you say it's ironic? And so she's arguing with Chris about this, and it begins to become like a little bit aggressive. So that's sort of the footnote argument, which becomes a little bit of a metaphor for the way that they're interacting with each other.
Right.
Yeah.
Because Apollo is basically trying to rape her. He's like a real threat, and she is terrified and basically gives up everything in order to feel some sense of safety, which who knows if she even gets. And then I was also struck just in the jacket copy, it's Chris's love is referred to as like what he mistakes as love. And I'm just wondering if you see it as that, like, could Chris love Tessa? Could it be, it's love to him, right?
It's definitely love to him. And this is one of the fun things about Chris, is that people are so all over the map about him, like every single reader. And I had a little window into this when we had like writers' workshops, because I would watch people argue about whether Chris was a full sociopath and just needed to go, or if Chris was, someone who was just really in love with this young woman, Tessa, and that, everything can be explained by that love, like all is fair in love and war, or whatever. And so I think that it's interesting, because the book is very interested in the Western canon, and all of us, even if we don't read poetry every day from the Western canon, I would still say that so much of our idea about love comes from these poets, comes from poetry, comes from rom-coms, which comes from the Renaissance poetry, which comes from Latin poetry. And the book is definitely trying to say that sort of love is problematic. And I mean, I'm not really going to answer your question just because I don't like it when writers do that, but I think it's important for every reader to sort of be challenged by that question and to make their own decision about it.
Yeah, because I mean, you're right. Like every rom-com, it's about like the chase. Like even the language we use around it, I mean, it recalls Apollo chasing Daphne down.
Yeah.
Okay, tell me a little bit about like how did you set out to write a thriller? Were you looking at books like The Secret History and Possession? Like what did you set out to do, and tell me a little bit about the early days of this process.
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of it being a thriller, I mean, I love thrillers. I love plot. I love Patricia Highsmith, The Talented Mr. Ripley. I love Gillian Flynn or Gillian Flynn. Maybe someday someone will explain to me which one it is. I love Gone Girl. I think you can see a lot of those books in this book. But I was also just really interested in characters who have a very strong desire. And, Tessa has an extremely strong desire to sort of achieve this life of the mind that she is passionate about for the best possible reasons. But then as she gets closer to like the material trappings of that success, it gets a little bit darker, and maybe she starts to do things she's not entirely proud of. I was really interested in characters who have strong desires, and Chris has this extremely strong desire for Tessa. And I don't think that necessarily made the book into a thriller, but I do think that it made it a little bit more of a suspense novel. And I think that, I saw that in Who is Maud Dixon as well, where Florence has this extremely strong desire, and you start to begin to see that like she might do anything for this. And that has all sorts of potential when you're thinking about suspense or thinking about a thriller, when you have a character that has a desire that's that strong.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, when I think of thrillers, I mean, I'm just thinking about this now. You either have a character whose back is up against the wall, and like, why would somebody do something that like so irrational? Like Chris's actions are crazy. Like,
yeah,
he didn't sit down and think this out as the best possible course of action. So there's like, why do people act like this? And I think you either have your back against the wall, like you're about to go bankrupt, or someone you love is about to get hurt, something, and you just have to act, or it's something in front of you, and it like puts blinders on you.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But yeah, I mean, I think that there's so much potential for suspense that comes from that. And there's so much potential, like with Chris, for example, I think that as a reader, you immediately are like, this guy's a little bit unhinged, but I think you don't know exactly what he's capable of. And I also think he doesn't know exactly what he's capable of. His wife has just left him. His mother is dying. He's in love with this younger woman. He doesn't seem to care that much about his job anymore. He's achieved, all of the success in the classics. And you're just like, you don't know yet what he's capable of. And that adds suspense. And I think that it's the same with Tessa. Like, the reader is inclined to like Tessa. And that notwithstanding, she begins to, do things in service of this desire that she has to find success in her career that, one begins to question. And I think that's really fun to play with as a writer. And it's really fun for me when I'm a reader, when you are not quite sure what a character is capable of. And so just for me, that's just something that's naturally interesting to me. And I think that that's what gives The Latinist like a little bit of a sort of suspense thriller vibe, even though it's also, a lot of other things. Yeah.
I mean, you say that the reader is inclined to like Tessa, which I think is correct. I mean, I liked her. Likability is something I've been thinking a lot about.
Yeah.
I don't tend to read my own Amazon reviews because it's masochistic, but when I do, it's a lot of people are like, oh, these characters were likable. They're not like, I mean, the word comes up over and over and over again. Oh, I didn't like them. I couldn't stand them. And I find it, I don't know, this impulse is very strange to me to like this character. And what do they even mean by that? Like, do they want to be their friend? They admire them? I mean, I think most of the, a lot of the best characters in fiction are terrible people who you would not want to be around, but they're fascinating. I mean, were you concerned with making Tessa likable?
I wasn't I was concerned with it in the sense that it was something that was on my mind. I wasn't concerned with it in the sense that I really wanted her to be this character that was going to reflect back the putative worldviews of the readers who were engaging with her. Because I do think that that's an element that is involved with, the many people who really want to have a likable character. They want to be able to admire a character, and it's reminiscent of this whole idea of heroes and villains, which is so important in mythology and in fairy tales and in the stories that were told as a kid. But which one of the things that I love about Ovid is that he just doesn't care about, like, he's very good at like subverting our expectations of what a hero is going to do or of what a villain is going to do. And that was definitely something that I think everyone can relate to, because people exist in shades of gray, and people who are bad people also have good characteristics, and people who are good people have bad characteristics. And I don't know, I could, like, you're preaching to the choir in terms of likability in fiction, but I just think it's also something in society broadly where we put people on a pedestal and we have purity tests, and that's maybe a more modern manifestation of it, but it was important to me that Tessa be human and that she'd be real, and that was the most important thing to me.
Yeah. Did you, I mean, when you, like, was that a concern with, like, you mentioned Chris's mother dying? Was that, there was this, Patricia Highsmith had this line about, obviously she was the expert in like wicked, deranged characters, but she said something, I can't remember where I heard this, but it was like, trying to make them like animals, because then the like, so like a lot of her characters are like her evil characters like have a dog or something.
Right.
But like, I think people do some, and I do it myself sometimes, like just have this little trick where you're like, oh, but like, look, he like gave $1 to a homeless guy or whatever.
Yeah.
And I don't know, was that part of your impetus for having Chris's mother be ill, just to like remind the reader, like, he has vulnerabilities, he has fragility, like.
I think that Chris is dealing with a lot of issues with his relationship with women. And to me, his mother dying and having to confront the nature of his relationship with his mother was just like a really nice add to him having to confront his relationship with Tessa. And I don't know if I do think that there was that sort of like added, it makes him a little bit more sympathetic, but that wasn't something I was really aware of as I was writing it. It was more like people told me that as they read drafts of it. And I sort of thought, okay, that's useful, maybe. But like, Chris also loves animals, so maybe I was doing that subconsciously as well. And he has these sheep who are just names like Nettie, Betty, and Betty.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or Nanny, or what's her name?
Yeah, Nettie and Betty and Betty. Yeah.
So did you write the bulk of this book at school? Were you getting feedback as you wrote it?
Yeah, I wrote most of it in Iowa City. And I think part of that was like wish fulfillment, where I wanted to be in Oxford. I spent my junior year of college at Oxford, and part of me just wanted to be there as opposed to in the cold, barren plains of the Midwest. But
yes, leave that comment for this talk, not the Prairie Lights talk.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I know. I need to filter myself sometime. But yeah, I wrote the entire first draft in Iowa City, and I was getting feedback from it as I was writing. I had a mentor myself whose name is Margot Livesey, and she's an amazing writer and amazing teacher. And so she was helping me like in thesis work, writing the novel. And so that helped enormously. But yeah, then came back to New York and did a couple more drafts here.
And you wrote the poetry in the book, right? I mean, there's not a ton of it, but what it is, you wrote. Did you do you have a background in poetry, or what was that process like?
I don't really have a background in poetry. It's kind of in my family insofar as my father really wanted to be a poet, and he was also a classics major. And my brother is a poet, like he publishes poetry. But I had never really done it except sort of like as a joke in high school and college. But I love poetry, and it was fun to try to find a way to write these. They're actually like translations of Latin poetry that doesn't exist. And
it was like a writing prompt or something that
I was like trying to figure out how to make that interesting to the layperson was really fun. I mean, I have like a bad translation of a short poem and then a good translation of a short poem. And in order to do the like good translation, I spent a lot of time reading poetry that I love, but I also spent a lot of time listening to music, which is what poetry was originally. And I listened to, I listened to like a lot of rap. I listened to Eminem. I listened to, like 5 or 6 different, rap songs that I was sort of memorizing, and trying to figure out how you can get a rhythm that like really gets in someone's head, because it just would be funny to me if you could write a poem from 0 AD that people would actually find catchy. So that was a fun process, and being able to see the bad translation next to the good translation, I think is going to be fun, like for anybody who reads
the translation of the poem that doesn't exist.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's like an Oulipo exercise or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you run the poems by your brother or no?
No, I didn't. I don't know. I did run them by someone at the University of Iowa who's studying the classics and specifically studying translation for the classics, who read some of them. And I think her immediate response was kind of like, is this Latin poetry that I've never heard of before? Like, who is this poet that you have a translation of?
How cool.
Which was really fun. And a lot of that was because I was like taking material from, old Latin poets. And, but yeah, I mean, even if Latin poetry is not something that a particular reader out there might salivate over, I do think that there's a lot of stuff in this book that makes all of this exciting. And so I was trying to sort of wrap my own weird arcane interests in bacon so that the reader would have something really fun to chew on.
A good way to put it. Yeah. The bacon is the love and obsession, and then
exactly.
What's bacon wrapped around? Celery. Celery is the Latin. So did you have to do a lot of research into, I mean, it really reads like somebody who has like at least a master's in the classics.
There was a lot of research into the Latin for sure. I mean, I was a Latin nerd in high school. Like, my idea of fun in high school was translating blocks of Virgil's Aeneid from Latin into the English, which you can imagine won me a lot of friends in high school. But like,
probably not in a Waffle House.
Not in a Waffle House, exactly. And that's sort of what Tessa is enduring when she's growing up in North Florida. And so I had some background in Latin, and I can read it very slowly, but not fluently at all. For the Latin, it's for the classics itself in a novel. Like, I don't know, academia is an interesting landscape. And I think that it's very relatable to almost anyone in a workplace environment. It's almost as if all of the dysfunction in a workplace environment is just, in a normal workplace environment, is like on steroids in academia, because there's so much idealism and also so much scarcity. And so I found that academia was actually a really, really fun setting for, two characters, or for just a normal human story or a timeless story about, a problematic relationship between an older man and a younger woman. And yeah, there was definitely research that needed to be done though for that. The academic conference that takes place towards the end of the book. I actually went to a academic conference in Oxford.
Cool.
Yeah, and just like attended it and watched and saw, what just like felt like what the rhythm of that was and what it felt like in the room. And so like, attending that conference was a huge help. I know some people who are classicists. And so just like by osmosis, hearing them talk about what they do, helped me. You just have those little details, like the cosmetic edits that are required for her paper that has the footnote that they're arguing about.
It's very rich in details. I mean, you really are steeped in it. It feels, it really takes you there. It was very impressive. I mean, it was very impressive.
But it's probably similar to you in with the publishing industry and Maud Dixon, which feels like as real as something can possibly be. And I feel like a lot of that has to do with like the details, but also just like, if you believe in the human relationships that are being dramatized, then you can believe in like the milieu that it's being set in. And so I definitely saw that in Maud Dixon as well. So yeah.
I'm just going to make a note that anyone who has questions can put them in the Q&A, and I'll read those in a moment or two. Before we go to questions, are you working on your next book?
Yeah, I mean, as I've alluded to, I'm not like an architect with writing. I mean, I try to be. I have the blueprint, but it never is what actually gets made. But hopefully, hopefully there's a gem, and usually there's a gem in there of something else that becomes the story. But I mean, I can say that what I'm working on right now is about, like, in a nutshell, the metaverse and its fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. And I just think that this is such a weird new manifestation of like synthetic realities. And you and I, as fiction writers, are both like purveyors or peddlers of synthetic realities. And I'm interested in where this is going to go, and interested, like, once, you get the injection of capitalism, like which reality takes priority. And that's something that I can relate to deeply as a writer. So hopefully there's like some fruitful material there.
That sounds very fruitful and fascinating. It's very like Westworld.
Yeah, like 100%.
Okay. This is a question. How do you choose your sometimes mundane details to give texture? Thinking about the modification to Tessa's bed for her boyfriend, Ben, or the cameo in Chris's dream sequence about his wife. It's random, but it makes it all feel very relatable. How do you make those decisions?
That's a great question. I think that a lot of it is trial and error. I wish that I had like a flow chart that I could use to make it easier. But yeah, I mean, just taking an example, the bed that Tessa and Ben share, there was something about the physicality of that where, Ben has to actually saw off the footboard so that he can lie fully at length because he's tall. And I think that just came from my own experience because that sometimes happens to me. But also, like, there's a lot in when you read, if you read the book, and it seems like you have, like, you'll notice some allusions to like amputation and the removal of, anyway, and with this, I don't want to spoil anything, but with this, there was the removal of a footboard that I thought was kind of amusing in resonance with the rest of the book. So I think that those things just came together, and I thought it was a fun thing to do.
All right. Were there any particular tools you used that might be helpful to other young writers like myself to write across gender, or works that inspired your ability to do so?
Yeah, that's a great question. Will I will say again, did I say this already? I spent a lot of time on Reddit
You didn't.
reading. No, I didn't. I spent every day after I finished writing, I would go on Reddit and go to the subreddit Ask Women or the subreddit Female Fashion Advice. And I would and I would learn all of these things that I did not know growing up as a man. And so as an example, you know, in the last few sections of the novel, Tessa is wearing these slingback shoes. And when she presents in the conferences, she's wearing a shell top. And these were not words that were in my vocabulary, but they were words that would be in Tessa's vocabulary. And they were also items that would be in her material reality. And for me as a writer, once I actually was able to put a name to that, it was one of those like incremental things that helped in addition to being able to like inhabit the space that she's inhabiting. So yeah, go to Reddit, do whatever it takes. Yeah.
All right. I enjoy the references to these statuesque romances from different eras, genres. Do either of you have favorite love stories in any format, classic or contemporary?
Do you want to take that one first?
I should be looking at my pages, love stories. There's this book, Little Big by John Crowley. Have you read that? It's like
I haven't read it.
Fantastical element, and it's one of those books that really just sweeps you in and takes you to a totally different place. He's such a talented writer, and there's a love story in that it's a very good one. And I happen to be sitting by the C's in my alphabetized books.
Yours are, mine are alphabetized too.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like a stupid answer, but I read every Jane Austen book while I was writing this novel. And it was actually enormously helpful to me, almost as like the negative space for what this novel is not, to be able to like work in like what that tradition is not. But my favorite one, also very unoriginally, is Pride and Prejudice. I love it's like 100 pages in, the dressing down that Mr. Darcy gets. I think it's amazing. And I don't know, that was just the first thing that popped into my head.
I mean, yeah, for romances, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Were there any real life news items or stories that helped inform your research and the dynamic between Tessa and Chris?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's hard to, I started writing this novel before the Me Too movement reignited into what it did in 2017. And I would say that, more than anything, that, magnified the themes in the novel and, made the themes more urgent, while it not being something that I was, setting out to mirror in any way. That is the sort of, for me, like the elephant in the room that I think had an effect on happening in the real world, that had an effect on writing the book.
This sort of goes along with that. I appreciate your mentioning that a portrayed relationship is intentionally problematic. Do you think contemporary writers bear some responsibility in making sure portrayals of abuse, manipulation are clearly contextualized as wrong? Or should writers assume some degree of intelligence and morality among readers to judge for themselves?
I think that's, it's a really important question that I think, everyone is dealing with in one way or another, who's writing difficult material. And, it's hard to say exactly how to sort of add, discretionary warnings. I think that I want readers to be able to decide things for themselves. And I believe and always want to have, the most intelligent readers who can make decisions about the material themselves. I don't know what that translates into in terms of, actual, like, actual labels or anything like that. But that's always sort of my response to, those questions. And then, with specific instances, I think that, things always become, easier to talk about in detail.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tricky question, which obviously not a clear answer, but I do think if you go back and look at great works of literature, I mean, even being written now, they don't have a message. I think there's a place for books that have a message that can teach people something, or, in a particular way, but that's not ever going to be literature.
Right. That's articulated better than.
I don't know what it was, but okay. This book has a lot of twists in it, some big, some small. Did you stumble on these twists while you were writing, or were these twists, this is like a tongue twister, or were these twists your fixed points and you filled in around them? Trying to be vague to avoid spoilers.
That's a great question. I can say happily that I sort of knew eventually where the book was going to go, almost like as a feeling inside of me. And a lot of that comes back to the footnote that we keep talking about, these different interpretations of what love mean. But I did not know exactly how it was going to get there. And I would say that for the twists that the reader is going to encounter in the book, those were as surprising to me as they hopefully will be to the reader. And I think that's the best way to do it. Yeah, there was some, getting stuck, and then I would be surprised by something that I thought was cool, and then I just go forward from there. So yeah, that's how it happened.
This is a question coming from me. Did you feel like once you got to know Tessa and Chris a little bit better, that they sort of started driving the narrative a bit more?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you spend so much time. I mean, writing a novel takes a long time, and you better be writing about something that you're interested in, because you're basically going to be living that reality for a long time. But eventually you get to the point where it's as real to you as anything else. And then, the characters do begin to take over.
Yeah. What was the process of taking Tessa and the readers to these far-flung locales? It starts off as almost a campus novel, but then obviously goes far beyond that scope. How did you decide on where these places would be and what they would be like?
It was not, again, I wish I had a flow chart for how to do this, because so much of it was trying and failing. Especially, they end up going to Italy, and that was a difficult scene to write. There's a lot of archaeology in it, which I don't know anything about, or didn't know anything about.
Yeah, you fooled us very well, because it seems like
I actually found someone who runs a field school in the island of Menorca off of Spain that is, oriented around a 5th century Roman colony, and it's called the Santa Sera Archaeological Institute. And this guy let me come and be a student for 2 weeks and just kind of tag along, and for their field school, which was, mostly actual students studying archaeology. And that, I mean, I couldn't have done it without that. I needed to actually have my hands in the dirt and understand, how painstakingly slow of a process it is, and just the rhythm of that whole profession. So there were certainly, things that I had to do to make it real, the far-flung locales. And yeah, that's probably the biggest investment I made for that.
Have you read The Names by DeLillo?
No, I haven't.
I mean, it's obviously,
I've heard it's good. Yeah.
But it's about like a sort of like casual anthropologist, I suppose.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah. Am I reaching an anthropologist? No, archaeologist.
Yeah,
sorry.
Yeah,
oh my gosh.
But there are also
archaeologists.
There are like so many subsets. There are also anthropologists in there, and it's all the above.
Okay. Go Fs. Shout out to Williams.
Oh.
I am very excited. I'm very excited to read this book. It seems like a book that had an extensive research process. Research often feels like something that can be all consuming and feel like it can go on forever. How did you figure out in your own process the balance between digging further and deciding, okay, I have enough, it's time to proceed with the story?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I think that I was in danger sometimes of going too far with the research, and sometimes I'd find myself just writing a scene that was almost like a procedural description of what would happen if something were to happen. And when I took a step back, I mean, like digging certain aspects of digging up ancient graves in a island off of the coast of Italy with someone who isn't supposed to be there. Like there's just a lot of weird complications there that you have to think your way through about how it would actually look before it can even be real to the characters. And so I think I realized that I had to stop with the research when I was writing stuff that was boring from that perspective, like that didn't have any, interpersonal meaning or wasn't in conversation with the struggles of the characters. And once I realized that I knew I had to focus on what's going to have meaning to the characters, that enabled me to stop doing the research, because I realized I already had so much material that I could make something out of. But I do think that it really is important to always come back to the characters and, what's going to be important to them and their struggles.
Were you doing the research like concurrently? Like, would you write scenes where like you didn't have the research yet, so you would just sort of leave like blank spaces, like insert research later? Or did you have the research before? You wouldn't start a scene until you had the research?
I was literally like, sometimes I would be really masochistic and I would force myself to try to imagine what it would be like without doing any research.
Oh my God.
And then I would do some research and I would look back at what I had written and just laugh at how off it was. But yeah, I mean, there were different, that was like the most inefficient way of doing it, but actually it was kind of fun sometimes and helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much work goes into a novel that is not in the novel.
Right. Yeah. 100%. It's an iceberg ratio. Yeah.
Okay. We've got a few more. The clarity and depth, some of the most peripheral characters in this novel, Lucretius, Liam, etc., is one of the most impressive parts of the book. I agree. Are those inspired by real life individuals?
Funnily enough, not really. I mean, thank you for saying that. Lucretia actually began as someone who was sort of based on someone real, but originally when I was writing the novel, it was Tessa and just all men. And I sort of didn't know why that was happening. And Lucretia became Lucretia and her name became Lucretia because originally there was some joke about her putting the lucre in Lucretia. And it just kind of happened slowly by adding layers. I think characters often do start off as someone but ultimately they become different aspects of yourself. And when you can begin to see aspects of yourself in them, then they become more real. And so I think that sort of happened with Liam and Lucretia and a lot of the minor characters.
Could you see this novel turning into a movie? This is, I think, going to be our last question. Could you see this novel turning into a movie?
I think it could be a great movie. I mean, I think that when people make books into movies, they have to turn it into their own thing. And my favorite movies that were books are usually the ones where like the movie was better than the book. So I hope it becomes a movie and that the movie is even better than the book. That would be wonderful. I think it has, tonal elements that could be very interesting on film. So the short answer is yes.
Okay, well, as much as we'd love to keep talking, we unfortunately cannot keep you any longer. But I get to ask the last question for both of you. So what are you guys currently reading and what would you like to suggest to our readers? What's on your nightstand these days?
I just finished a book. Was it? Yeah, late last night. Oh shoot! Now I'm gonna have to Google it while I talk because I can't remember the name. It's by Emmanuel Carrere. And it's this crazy story. It's a true crime story about this doctor who failed out of his second year of medical school, never told anybody, got married, had children, lived this life for 20 years. Everyone thought he was working as a doctor. And then when he was about to be found out, he murdered his whole family. And Emmanuel Carrère is this French writer who's just, I mean, he's an incredible writer just on his own without a story like this, but he approaches the story, I mean, just brilliantly. So now I really do have to find the title. Let's see.
Go ahead.
The Adversary, that's it.
And for me, I mean, I would say to anyone who's on this, who has not read Who is Maud Dixon, that they should read Who is Maud Dixon. Nice. I also recently read, or not recently, but I think that people should read Real Life and Filthy Animals by Brandon Taylor, who's someone I was in grad school with, who's extremely talented and doesn't need me to be doing publicity for him at all. And right now I'm actually going through a list of thrillers that I got from Alexandra, and I'm reading Still Lives by Maria Hummel, and I think it's fantastic. So I haven't finished, but I would definitely recommend that.
All right. Well, thank you, Mark and Alexandra, for sharing your time with us. And to everyone who came by tonight, we appreciate you here. Your patronage is what enables us to bring you programming like this. And we cannot continue to host these types of events without the book sale to support them. And you can do that by using the link in the chat to purchase The Latinist. One more time. And don't forget to check our website for the most up-to-date event listings, as we have an amazing list to choose from. Mark, Alexandra, thank you so much for your wonderful insight, for your warmth, and we do hope to see you all soon under much safer circumstances. And thank you once again for joining us this evening. So to everyone here, stay safe, stay warm, and stay well-read. We will see you all next time. Bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Good night. Happy New Year.